At 11:45 p.m. on a Friday night in March 2024, security guard Ramos pushed open the door to MRI Suite 2C at Palmetto Memorial Hospital and discovered what would become Miami's most notorious medical murder case. The machine was still humming, its magnetic field active, and inside the cylindrical bore of the 60,000-pound Siemens magnetom scanner lay Isadora Mercado's body, surrounded by surgical instruments that had become projectiles traveling at 40 miles per hour. 3 pairs of scissors embedded in her torso, for hemostats like metal daggers in her flesh. A metal clipboard that had struck her skull with enough force to fracture bone. An oxygen tank that had crushed the left side of her face. A wheelchair pinning her body inside the 23.6-inch diameter tunnel. Blood pooled beneath the machine in patterns that suggested she had been conscious when the impacts began, had tried to crawl toward the opening, had died knowing exactly who had activated the machine and why. It took first responders 47 minutes to shut down the magnetic field completely, and when they finally pulled Isadora's body from the bore at 12:39 a.m., the medical examiner would count 23 separate impact wounds, 14 of which individually could have proven fatal. But the oxygen tank to her skull was what killed her, the catastrophic brain hemorrhage that ended 8 years of devotion, manipulation, financial entrapment, and a love affair that was never really love at all. The story that led to that MRI suite began 8 years earlier on a Tuesday morning in September 2016, when Dr. Sebastian Vance stood in the cardiac catheterization lab at Palmetto Memorial Hospital reviewing the schedule for his 9 a.m. procedure and thinking about the mistress he'd recently discarded and the pharmaceutical sales territory she'd left behind after her second suicide attempt finally succeeded. Sebastian was 36 years old that morning, standing at the peak of a career constructed through equal parts genuine brilliance and carefully hidden sociopathy. He had performed 1,847 successful cardiac catheterizations, published 34 peer-reviewed papers, and earned $680,000 annually, not counting consulting fees that added another $140,000 to his income. He drove a midnight blue Porsche 911 Carrera worth $120,000, lived in a 7,200-square-foot Coral Gables estate valued at $4.2 million, and was married to Margot Sutherland, whose family owned Sutherland Development Corporation and controlled approximately 40% of downtown Miami's commercial real estate. The marriage was a business arrangement that both parties understood perfectly. Margot maintained the social status and family empire. Sebastian provided the respectable medical credentials and occasional appearance at charity galas. They shared a house, a portfolio, and absolutely nothing resembling emotional intimacy. Isadora Mercado walked into that catheterization lab for her first day orientation at 8:47 a.m., wearing scrubs that were slightly too large for her small frame, carrying a bag containing her nursing credentials, 2 protein bars, and a photograph of her family standing outside their home in Quezon City that she looked at every morning to remind herself why she'd left the Philippines. She was 31 years old, possessed exceptional medical training from University of Santo Tomas, where professors had praised her steady hands and intuitive understanding of cardiac anatomy, and carried crushing debt that made her vulnerable in ways she didn't yet understand would be weaponized against her. Her father Ricardo's printing business had collapsed during an economic downturn in 2014, leaving the family with 2.8 million Cuban pesos in debt, approximately $52,000. Her mother, Elena, needed medication for hypertension that cost 18,000 Cuban pesos monthly. Her 3 younger siblings were still in university, requiring tuition payments that consumed every spare peso. Isadora had worked 3 years in Manila hospitals, sending home 70% of her salary while living in a studio apartment she shared with 2 other nurses, calculating that at Philippine wage rates she would be 51 years old before her family was financially stable. The work visa to Palmetto Memorial changed everything. American catheterization lab nurses earned $78,000 annually, nearly 6 times her Manila salary. After taxes and rent on a studio apartment in a marginal neighborhood for $1,600 monthly, she could send home $3,100 every 30 days. It still wouldn't eliminate the debt, but it would keep her family housed and fed and her mother medicated while her siblings finished school. She never made it to the orientation session. At 9:03 a.m., an emergency case arrived in the catheterization lab. A 68-year-old patient named Thomas Morrison was coding during what should have been a routine stent placement, his cardiac rhythm deteriorating into ventricular fibrillation that would kill him within minutes if they couldn't stabilize the arrhythmia and complete the procedure. Sebastian was already scrubbed in, already threading the catheter through femoral artery toward the blocked coronary vessel. already calculating the medication dosages, when the patient's blood pressure crashed to 60/40. The attending nurse fumbled with the emergency drug cart, her hands shaking as alarms screamed from the monitors. Sebastian needed specific equipment immediately, needed someone who could anticipate the cascade of interventions required to save this patient's life. Isadora appeared beside him at 9:04 a.m., having abandoned orientation when she heard the code called overhead. Her hands moved with a precision that Sebastian recognized instantly as exceptional talent. She handed him the correct catheter size before he requested it, prepared the epinephrine and atropine in exact dosages without being asked, adjusted the imaging equipment angle to give him optimal visualization. By 9:22 a.m., they had stabilized Morrison's rhythm, completed the stent placement, and watched his vital signs normalize to sustainable levels. The patient would survive because Isadora Mercado understood cardiac crisis management with an intuition that couldn't be taught. Sebastian found her in the equipment sterilization room at 2:47 p.m. She was cleaning the instruments from Morrison's procedure, her movements methodical and careful, when he closed the door behind him and said the words that would seal her fate. "You're extraordinary. Where did you learn to move like that?" Isadora turned, surprised by his presence in the small room that smelled of disinfectant and metal. "University of Santo Tomas, sir. 8 years in cardiac critical care before coming here." Her voice carried the slight accent that Sebastian found simultaneously exotic and indicative of lower social status, the kind of woman who would be grateful for attention from someone like him. He stepped closer, invading her personal space in a way that should have sent her running but instead made her freeze in that universal response of women who've been socialized to be polite even when uncomfortable. "That patient should have died. You saved him as much as I did." His hand reached up to touch her face, his fingers tracing her jawline. "I want to know you better, Isadora." She should have stepped back, should have reminded him about professional boundaries and the power differential between attending physician and new staff nurse. Instead, she felt her body respond to the first genuine compliment she'd received since arriving in America 3 weeks ago, living in a neighborhood where she was afraid to walk after dark, eating ramen noodles for dinner while calculating money transfers to Manila. When Sebastian kissed her, she kissed him back. When his hands moved to her scrubs, pulling her closer against the metal cabinet, she didn't stop him. The sexual encounter lasted 7 minutes, was performed with the door unlocked in a room anyone could have entered, and established a pattern of risk and poor judgment that would characterize their entire relationship. The affair that developed over the following months looked like romance to Isadora and like grooming to anyone who understood predatory behavior. Sebastian didn't just want her body, though the physical relationship was intense in ways that left marks Isadora covered with long sleeves and high necklines. He wanted her emotional labor. He started confessing things during their hotel meetings twice weekly at the Brickell Bay Inn, where he paid cash for rooms registered under false names. He told her about his father, renowned cardiac surgeon Dr. Ramos Vance, who had died of a massive heart attack at age 52, while Sebastian was 16 years old. Told her about watching his father's body in the casket and understanding with horrible certainty that he carried the same genetic markers, the same family history of early cardiac disease, the same likelihood of dying young before accomplishing enough to justify his existence. Told her about medical school struggles with undiagnosed ADHD that made him feel stupid compared to classmates who could focus for 8-hour study sessions while he needed movement and stimulation and felt like an imposter every time he passed an exam. Told her about the medical error during his residency at Bayside Regional Hospital in 2013, a patient named Richard Morrison who died because Sebastian had been hungover and miscalculated a medication dosage, and how the death had been attributed to complications rather than malpractice because Sebastian had falsified the chart before anyone reviewed it carefully. He cried when he told her these things, actual tears running down his face while Isadora held him and whispered that he wasn't that person anymore, that he'd saved hundreds of lives since then, that past mistakes didn't define present character. Sebastian needed that absolution, needed someone who saw him as human and flawed and forgivable. Margot looked at him like a business asset whose value was measured in social status and professional reputation. Isadora looked at him like he was worthy of love. For Isadora, Sebastian represented everything she'd hoped America would provide. He was brilliant, successful, powerful, and he chose her despite having access to countless women of higher social status. When he touched her, she felt valuable. When he needed her in the catheterization lab during complex procedures, she felt essential. When he told her she was the only person who truly understood him, she felt like her sacrifices had meaning beyond just sending money home. She ignored warning signs that any objective observer would have recognized as massive red flags waving in hurricane winds. The canceled plans when Margot demanded his presence at social events. The months between hotel visits when Sebastian claimed he was too busy with surgeries. The way he never answered her calls after 8 p.m. or on weekends. The fact that he'd never taken her to dinner at an actual restaurant where they might be seen together. Isadora told herself these were necessary accommodations to a complicated situation, that Sebastian needed time to figure out how to leave his marriage, that patience and devotion would eventually be rewarded with the commitment she craved. The financial entrapment began in February 2017, 6 months into their relationship, when Isadora's father was rushed to Manila General Hospital with diabetic ketoacidosis, his blood sugar levels so catastrophically high that kidney function was failing and doctors gave him 48 hours to live without emergency intervention. The surgery and treatment would cost 340,000 Cuban pesos, approximately $6,300. Isadora's savings account showed $847. She had already maxed out the one credit card she qualified for as an immigrant on a work visa, and her other option was a payday loan company that quoted interest rates of 24% for foreign nationals with no collateral. She stood in the hospital supply closet at 2 a.m. trying to muffle her sobs while reading her brother Miguel's text messages that described their father slipping in and out of consciousness and asking for Isadora, and saying he was sorry for the burden his business failure had created. Sebastian found her there at 2:17 a.m., having noticed her absence from the nurse's station during a routine post-procedure check. When she explained through tears what was happening, he pulled out his personal checkbook and wrote a check for $6,500 while she watched in stunned disbelief. "Pay me back whenever you can," he said, closing her fingers around the check. "There's no rush. Family takes care of family, and you're part of my family now." Isadora deposited the check the next morning, transferred the money to Manila, and watched her father stabilize over the following week, while she sat in the hospital break room calculating repayment schedules. At $500 monthly, it would take 13 months. She could do this. She started a ledger in a small notebook, writing $6,500 loan from Dr. Vance, February 14, 2017, at the top of the first page, planning to record every payment until the debt was cleared. The debt never decreased. Instead, it metastasized like the malignancy it represented, growing with each family crisis that Isadora couldn't solve alone and Sebastian appeared to solve effortlessly. 3 months after the first loan, Miguel called to explain that their father's printing business faced legal action over accumulated debts, that creditors were threatening bankruptcy proceedings that would seize the family home where Isadora's parents had lived for 32 years, and where her mother Elena had planted the garden that she tended like therapy for the depression that came from watching her husband's business collapse and her children scatter across the globe seeking work. The amount needed to settle the most aggressive creditors and prevent immediate foreclosure was 485,000 Cuban pesos, approximately $8,900. Isadora spent 2 weeks researching alternative solutions, approaching loan companies that quoted interest rates so predatory they would have taken decades to repay, before Sebastian noticed her distraction during a cardiac catheterization procedure when she handed him the wrong size guide wire and nearly compromised the patient's femoral artery. When he asked what was troubling her, she initially deflected, but he pressed with the gentle insistence that felt like genuine concern rather than the manipulation it actually represented. She told him. He wrote another check, this one for $9,000 to cover the debt plus a small buffer. "I can't keep taking your money," Isadora protested, her voice breaking. "Yes, you can," Sebastian replied. "What kind of man would I be if I let the woman I love suffer when I have the resources to help?" It was the first time he'd said he loved her, and those words combined with the financial rescue made Isadora feel like maybe this relationship was real. Maybe Sebastian was planning a future with her. Maybe her patience would be rewarded. 6 months later, Miguel's acceptance to medical school brought simultaneous pride and panic. Their youngest sibling achieving what Isadora had sacrificed, becoming the doctor she'd abandoned her own dreams to support financially. But medical school in the Philippines required 450,000 Cuban pesos annually for tuition, approximately $8,400 per year for 4 years. Isadora's brother tried to defer enrollment, but Sebastian heard about the situation and established automatic monthly transfers of $700 directly to the university, ensuring Miguel's education continued while creating another thread in the web of financial dependence. The ledger that Isadora maintained in her notebook showed increasingly alarming numbers. By March 2019, the total had reached $89,700 in loans and regular transfers, not counting the interest that Sebastian mentioned casually was accruing at what he called a reasonable 6% annually. At Isadora's current ability to save, she would be 57 years old before clearing the debt. She was financially enslaved for life to a man she wasn't sure actually loved her or was simply using her body while enjoying the gratitude her financial desperation created. The apartment situation unfolded with calculated precision that Isadora only recognized as manipulation years later when it was far too late to escape. When her original lease in the marginal neighborhood expired in December 2017, the landlord announced a rent increase to $2,100 monthly that she absolutely could not afford while maintaining the family payments to Manila and covering her own minimal living expenses. She began searching for cheaper options, looking at places in neighborhoods even farther from the hospital that would require longer commute times on public transportation she found unreliable and frightening. Sebastian mentioned during a break between procedures that a colleague owned a building in Brickell with a vacancy. The building was called Meridian Towers, a fictional mid-rise with updated amenities and a security desk that made Isadora feel safer than she'd felt since arriving in America. The apartment was substantially nicer than her current studio, a two-bedroom unit with a balcony overlooking the courtyard and appliances that actually functioned properly, and the rent was inexplicably listed at only $1,400 monthly when comparable units in the building advertised for $3,200. The building manager, a middle-aged man who avoided eye contact and seemed nervous during the showing, explained that the owner occasionally offered discounted rates to medical professionals as a community service. Isadora signed the lease immediately, grateful and relieved. What she didn't know was that Sebastian owned Meridian Towers through a shell corporation called Apex Holdings LLC, that he personally paid the $1,800 monthly difference between her subsidized rent and the market rate, and that he'd had keys cut for himself before she moved in, giving him unrestricted access to enter whenever he wanted without her knowledge or permission. The affair's routines became as structured as surgical protocols. Tuesday and Thursday nights, after Margot's standing board meetings that ran from 7 p.m. until 9:30 p.m., Sebastian would text Isadora from a burner phone he'd purchased with cash at an electronics store under a false name. The messages were always variations of the same theme: need to see you, miss you, coming over at 10:15. Isadora would wait in the apartment he secretly owned, showering and preparing herself, knowing he would arrive exactly on time and leave by 12:30 a.m., the precise window when building security changed shifts and the hallway cameras experienced their scheduled maintenance blackout that Sebastian had personally arranged with the building manager through financial incentives Isadora never learned about. The physical relationship escalated in intensity over the months, sex that started as passionate and became increasingly rough, leaving bruises on Isadora's arms and thighs and ribs that she covered carefully with long sleeves and high necklines. When she mentioned that he was hurting her, Sebastian would apologize and then do the exact same things the next time, his need for dominance and control manifesting in physical ways that foreshadowed the psychological torture to come. The late-night confessions continued, Sebastian using Isadora as unpaid therapist to process the darkness he couldn't share with anyone else. He told her about destroying his previous mistress, a pharmaceutical representative named Diane Torres, who had worked the cardiac device territory at Palmetto Memorial from 2010 to 2014. Diane had been beautiful, competent, useful for getting preferred pricing on surgical equipment, and willing to meet Sebastian in supply closets for quick encounters between meetings. When Diane started wanting more, wanting actual relationship, wanting him to acknowledge her publicly, wanting promises he had no intention of keeping, Sebastian had fabricated evidence of sample theft, reported her to her company and the hospital, gotten her fired and blacklisted from the pharmaceutical industry entirely. Diane had attempted suicide 6 months later, pills and alcohol in her apartment, where neighbors found her barely breathing. She survived that attempt. The second attempt a year later succeeded, and Sebastian described it to Isadora like an amusing anecdote rather than the murder-adjacent crime it represented. She was unstable, he said, lying in Isadora's bed after sex, his hand idly stroking her hip. Some people can't handle rejection. That's not my fault. Isadora listened with growing horror but told herself Sebastian was different now, that loving her had changed him, that past cruelty didn't predict future behavior. The surveillance system was installed in June 2018 with Sebastian framing it as protection rather than violation. "I worry about you living alone," he said, standing in her apartment with the installation kit he'd purchased from a specialty security company that catered to clients wanting discreet monitoring. "Miami's dangerous. I want to make sure you're safe if anything happens." The system he installed included 4 cameras positioned to capture every aspect of her private life. One in the living room angled to show the entrance and main living space. One in the kitchen covering the small dining area where she ate her solitary meals. One in the bedroom positioned to view the bed with perfect clarity. One covering the apartment entrance from the hallway. Sebastian explained that the feeds connected to a secure server that only he could access, ensuring that if anything happened to her, break-in, medical emergency, any crisis, help would arrive within minutes because he was always watching over her. What he didn't explain was that he watched her constantly, obsessively, checking the feeds on his phone during surgeries, studying her movements when she thought she was alone, accumulating footage of her showering, changing clothes, crying on the phone to her family, standing on the balcony at 2 a.m. staring down at the street 12 floors below with an expression that suggested she was contemplating whether the fall would kill her instantly. He kept all the footage, backing it up to external drives, building an archive of her most private moments that he reviewed during the hours when he couldn't physically be with her. The phone monitoring began in October 2018 when Palmetto Memorial Hospital announced that all medical staff would receive new devices to ensure HIPAA compliance with patient data regulations. The phones were top-of-the-line iPhones that looked identical to consumer models but came preloaded with hospital software that supposedly protected sensitive medical information from unauthorized access. What Isadora didn't know was that her specific device contained additional monitoring software that allowed Sebastian to read her text messages, track her GPS location, access her photos, and review her call history in real time. When she texted a colleague in February 2019 saying she felt overwhelmed and trapped by work demands, Sebastian knew within 7 minutes and appeared at her apartment that evening with flowers and reassurances, somehow intuiting exactly what she needed to hear before she told anyone else. She thought he was remarkably perceptive and emotionally intelligent. The reality was surveillance and manipulation, using her private communications to position himself as her savior and only true support. Isadora's first serious attempt to escape came in March 2019 when she submitted an application for a cardiac catheterization position at Sunrise Medical Center in Fort Lauderdale, 45 minutes away from Miami. The position offered $95,000 annually, substantially more than her current salary of $78,000, and the distance represented psychological freedom from Sebastian's constant presence. She submitted the application on Monday evening, received a call requesting an interview on Wednesday, and scheduled the meeting for the following week. On Tuesday evening, Sebastian appeared at her apartment at 10:30 p.m., his expression serious rather than affectionate. "We need to talk about your future," he said, producing a manila folder containing documentation that made Isadora's escape impossible. Every loan he'd given her was detailed with dates and amounts. The promissory note bore what appeared to be her signature, though Isadora didn't remember signing any such document, and the legal language stated that the full amount would become immediately due within 30 days if she resigned from Palmetto Memorial Hospital for any reason. The total, including accumulated interest calculated at 8% annually, was $127,300. Isadora's savings account showed $1,240. Sebastian explained with practiced patience that hospital policy required all employee debts to be settled before resignation, that failure to repay would result in legal action, damage to her credit, and potential complications with her visa status since accepting money for personal services under a work visa could be interpreted as a legal activity that would trigger deportation proceedings. She withdrew her application the next morning and never tried to leave again. The COVID-19 pandemic arrived in Miami in March 2020 and transformed Palmetto Memorial Hospital into a war zone where cardiac procedures continued because heart attacks didn't respect global health crises and patients still needed emergency catheterizations, regardless of the virus spreading through ventilation systems and contaminating every surface. Isadora worked 84-hour weeks treating COVID-positive patients experiencing cardiac complications, wearing N95 masks that left pressure sores on her face and protective equipment that made her sweat through her scrubs during 12-hour shifts. Sebastian worked similar hours but faced a domestic problem that Isadora initially interpreted as opportunity. Margot was terrified of infection, had read every article about viral transmission, and refused to allow Sebastian into their Coral Gables estate unless he showered at the hospital and changed into clean clothes stored in his car. The precautions were reasonable given the circumstances, but they resulted in Sebastian spending less time at home and more time needing somewhere else to sleep. That somewhere became Isadora's apartment in Meridian Towers, the two-bedroom unit he secretly owned and had been using for twice-weekly visits. In March 2020, Sebastian moved in temporarily with a suitcase containing 5 days of clothes and a promise that this arrangement would last only until the pandemic situation stabilized enough for Margot to feel safe having him home. 17 months later, in August 2021, Sebastian was still living in Isadora's apartment. She had experienced something approximating marriage during that time, cooking dinner every evening after exhausting shifts, doing laundry, cleaning up after him, watching Sebastian work from her dining table on hospital administrative duties while she meal prepped for the week. They fell into domestic routines that felt like partnership to Isadora. Morning coffee together before driving separately to Palmetto Memorial. Evening debriefs about difficult cases and patient outcomes. Weekend grocery shopping at the Publix 3 blocks away where Sebastian would critique her choices and redirect her toward cheaper options while spending $180 on wine for himself. Isadora told herself this was proof he loved her, that living together meant their relationship was progressing toward the commitment she'd been waiting for. The reality that she couldn't see was that Sebastian was exploiting free housing, free domestic labor, and available sex while Margot continued paying all his actual expenses. The mortgage on the estate he still legally lived in, his Porsche payments, his health insurance premiums, his country club membership. Isadora fed him, cleaned up after him, met his physical and emotional needs while working full-time in pandemic conditions that left her perpetually exhausted and increasingly resentful of the invisible weight she carried. The breaking point came on September 7, 2021, when Sebastian packed his belongings on a Tuesday morning and announced he was moving back to Coral Gables. Margot's father, Bennett Sutherland, had suffered a minor stroke at age 73, and Margot demanded Sebastian's presence at home for family unity during the crisis. Sebastian left Isadora's apartment at 9:47 a.m., taking everything including the toothbrush he kept in her bathroom, the coffee pods he preferred, the medical journals he'd been reading. There was no discussion about what 17 months of cohabitation had meant. No acknowledgement that this might be difficult for Isadora. Just a text message sent at 10:15 a.m. after he'd already left. Margot needs me home. See you Thursday at usual time. Isadora stood in the apartment that suddenly felt enormous and empty, understanding with crushing clarity that 17 months of playing house had meant absolutely nothing to Sebastian. She had been convenient storage for his body and belongings during a pandemic, not a partner building a shared life. That night, she stood on her 12th floor balcony for 53 minutes, her hands gripping the railing, looking down at Brickell Avenue where cars moved like illuminated insects, and the concrete sidewalk promised immediate cessation of the pain that had become her constant companion. She calculated whether the fall would kill her instantly or leave her paralyzed and even more helpless than she already was. What stopped her was the automated bank notification that appeared on her phone at 2:47 a.m., reminding her that the monthly $3,400 transfer to Manila was pending approval. Her brother Miguel's medical school tuition was due. Her mother Elena's blood pressure medication needed refilling. Her father Ricardo's insulin requirements never stopped regardless of whether Isadora wanted to keep living. She was trapped not just by Sebastian's financial control but by her own love for her family, and that dual cage was more effective than any physical prison could have been. The evidence collection began in October 2021 when Isadora discovered that Sebastian's surveillance cameras fed to a cloud server she could access using his laptop that he'd forgotten at her apartment after moving out. She spent 3 days learning the system, downloading everything, accumulating footage that documented 3 years of her private life being violated. 47 hours of video showing her showering, dressing, crying, sleeping, existing in ways she'd believed were unseen. But more importantly, she discovered Sebastian never deleted any files from his own activities. Audio recordings existed of every conversation they'd had in the apartment, including confessions that could destroy him. Sebastian describing the medical error in 2013 at Bayside Regional Hospital that killed Richard Morrison because Sebastian had been hungover and miscalculated a medication dosage. Sebastian explaining how he falsified surgical success rates to improve Palmetto Memorial's ranking in cardiac care metrics, deliberately upcoding procedures to generate higher Medicare reimbursements. Sebastian talking about destroying Diane Torres with obvious satisfaction, describing how he'd fabricated evidence of pharmaceutical sample theft and ensured she'd never work in the industry again, mentioning casually that he'd heard she killed herself and expressing zero remorse. Sebastian discussing his cocaine use that had started in 2019 during a particularly stressful period and escalated during the pandemic, describing how he'd do a line in the parking garage before complex procedures to maintain focus and energy. Isadora began her own secret recordings in November 2021, using her phone to capture every conversation, building an insurance policy against the day when Sebastian might try to destroy her the way he'd destroyed Diane. She created an encrypted cloud backup account that Sebastian didn't know existed, uploading files systematically, organizing them by date and content type. By March 2022, she had accumulated evidence that could end Sebastian's career, potentially result in criminal charges, and certainly destroy his marriage if Margot's father learned that Sebastian had been defrauding Medicare and using cocaine before operating on patients. Isadora told herself she was creating insurance, protection against being discarded and ruined. The reality was that she was building ammunition for the blackmail that would eventually get her killed. The dating incident in March 2022 demonstrated the full extent of Sebastian's control over not just Isadora's life but anyone who entered her orbit. Dr. Ramos Williams was a 34-year-old emergency medicine attending at Palmetto Memorial, Filipino-American with family roots in Quezon City, who spoke Tagalog and made Isadora feel connected to home in ways she hadn't experienced since leaving Manila. He noticed her eating alone in the hospital cafeteria for the third consecutive day and gathered courage to ask if he could join her. They talked for 40 minutes about their families, about the experience of being caught between Filipino and American cultures, about the loneliness of working impossible hours while trying to maintain some connection to identity. Ramos asked if she wanted to have dinner at Café Manila, an authentic Filipino restaurant in Kendall that served lechon and lumpia and halo-halo that actually tasted like home. Isadora hesitated, her first instinct to refuse because Sebastian wouldn't approve, before realizing how insane that thought was and accepting the invitation. The Saturday evening dinner was the first time in 8 years that Isadora felt like a normal person having a normal date. Ramos told her about his Lola in Quezon City, who sent him boxes of dried mangoes and pan de sal. He taught her Tagalog phrases she'd forgotten during years of Sebastian insisting she speak only English around him. He made her laugh until tears ran down her face, real laughter rather than the performative responses she'd learned to give Sebastian's cruel jokes. When Ramos walked her to her car at the end of the evening, his kiss on her cheek was gentle and respectful, and his promise to call her during the week felt genuine rather than manipulative. For the first time since 2016, Isadora allowed herself to imagine a future that didn't include Sebastian Vance. Monday morning arrived with devastating efficiency. Ramos was summoned to Dr. Patricia Langford's office at 8:15 a.m. Langford, the chief of medicine at Palmetto Memorial, was 58 years old with a reputation for icy professionalism and absolute loyalty to the hospital's interests. She informed Ramos that an urgent opening had emerged in the rural physician program in Montana, that his exceptional skills made him the ideal candidate for immediate transfer, and that he would be relocating within 2 weeks. Ramos protested, explaining that his family lived in Miami, that he'd built his entire life in Florida, that he'd never expressed any interest in rural medicine. Langford's response was delivered with bureaucratic finality. The transfer was non-negotiable, and refusal would be noted in his permanent employment file as evidence of insufficient commitment to serving underserved communities, effectively ending any chance of career advancement within the hospital system. Ramos called Isadora that evening, his voice containing confusion and hurt, asking if she'd mentioned their date to anyone, if something he'd said or done had triggered this targeted destruction of his career. Isadora knew immediately what had happened but couldn't explain without admitting she was trapped in a relationship with a man who monitored her every movement and destroyed anyone who threatened his control. That evening, Sebastian appeared at her apartment at 10:15 p.m. with takeout from Lotus Garden, their usual Thai restaurant. "Heard about that resident bothering you," he said casually while unpacking pad Thai and spring rolls. "Took care of it for you. He had gambling debts and relationship problems, would have hurt you eventually. I protected you." The claims about Ramos were complete fabrications, but Ramos was already gone, transferred to Montana before Isadora could verify anything or explain to him what had actually happened. The message Sebastian sent was devastatingly clear. He controlled not just her life but the lives of anyone who entered her world, and attempting to build connections outside their relationship would result in those people being destroyed as collateral damage. The financial noose continued tightening throughout 2020 through 2022 as Isadora's family faced cascading crises that required escalating amounts of money. Her father Ricardo needed a second surgery in June 2020 for infection complications from his initial procedure, costing $23,000 that Sebastian wired within 24 hours. Miguel needed medical equipment and supplies for his clinical rotations, another $8,700 that Sebastian provided. Elena's breast cancer recurred in January 2022, requiring aggressive chemotherapy that cost $44,000 for the full treatment protocol. Isadora's younger sister Sofia got engaged, and cultural obligations meant Isadora was expected to contribute substantially to the wedding expenses even though she was living in America and supposedly wealthy by Filipino standards. Sebastian provided $15,000 toward the wedding while reminding Isadora exactly how much she owed him. By December 2022, the total had reached $217,000 in principal. Interest accruing at what Sebastian claimed was a reasonable 6% annually brought the amount to $234,500 when calculated over the accumulated years. At Isadora's current salary, after taxes, rent, food, and basic expenses, she could save perhaps $400 monthly. She would be 67 years old before clearing the debt, assuming no additional family emergencies required more money. She was financially enslaved for life to a man who treated her like property he could use and discard at will. January 14, 2024 was Isadora's 39th birthday, and Sebastian forgot completely. She waited all day for a text message, a phone call, any acknowledgement that she'd survived another year in the cage he'd constructed around her life. Nothing came. At 6:47 p.m., she sent him a gentle reminder, "It's my birthday today. Would love to see you if you have time." His response arrived 23 minutes later. "I have valve replacement at 6 a.m. tomorrow. Can't track every fucking detail, ISA." He didn't apologize, didn't promise to make it up to her. Just dismissed her like she was an irritating obligation rather than someone he'd claimed to love for 8 years. That night, alone in the apartment he secretly owned, Isadora conducted an inventory of her life that led to conclusions she'd been avoiding through desperate hope and willful denial. She was 39 years old. The years from 31 to 39, her prime years for building a real life, finding a genuine partner, possibly having children if she'd wanted them, had been spent as a secret mistress to a married man who saw her as a convenient receptacle for his physical needs and emotional baggage. She had no real friends because Sebastian had systematically isolated her from anyone who might have helped her see the relationship clearly. She had no savings because every dollar went either to Manila or to surviving in Miami on wages that barely covered her expenses. She had no future except more of the same until Sebastian tired of her completely and destroyed her the way he'd destroyed Diane Torres. Something broke inside Isadora that night, some fundamental illusion that had sustained her through 8 years of humiliation and exploitation. At 2:47 a.m. on January 15, 2024, she composed a text message that would initiate the sequence of events leading to her death in an MRI machine. 8 years. I've given you everything. My body, my time, my future, my dignity. Your wife doesn't love you? Your words, said thousands of times. You say I'm your soulmate. Your words, recorded and saved. Marry me or we're done. Not a request, a demand. Final answer by March 1st or I walk away from everything. She pressed send before fear could stop her, then lay awake until sunrise watching her phone and wondering if she'd just signed her own death warrant. Sebastian read the message during morning rounds at 7:15 a.m. while reviewing a patient's post-catheterization recovery. His first instinct was rage. How dare this nurse, this immigrant he'd elevated from poverty, demand anything from him? But his years of manipulating vulnerable women had taught him that immediate anger was less effective than strategic delay. He ignored the message for 72 hours, letting Isadora marinate in anxiety and uncertainty, before responding with false warmth. You're right. We need to talk about our future, face to face. Can you come over tomorrow night? Isadora agreed immediately, desperate to believe that her ultimatum had finally forced Sebastian to take their relationship seriously. The confrontation on February 13, 2024 occurred in Isadora's apartment at 11:30 p.m. after Sebastian finished a late surgery. He arrived furious despite the sweet tone of his text message. His face flushed and his movements aggressive as he closed the door behind him. "Are you fucking insane?" he said without preamble. "Do you understand what divorce would cost me? Margot's father controls my hospital privileges through his position on the board. I'd lose my credentials, my surgical access, my reputation. And financially, the prenup protects the Sutherland family money, but I'd lose the house, the investments, everything I've worked my entire life to build. You think I'm throwing that away for you?" Isadora's voice shook but remained determined. "Then we move. You're brilliant, you could work anywhere. Dallas, Phoenix, Charlotte, anywhere outside Margot's father's influence. We start fresh. I don't need the mansion or the money or the social status. I just need you, like you've always said you wanted." She believed what she was saying, convinced that Sebastian's 8 years of confessions and promises represented genuine love rather than the therapeutic manipulation it had always been. Sebastian stared at her like she'd revealed herself as fundamentally delusional. "You actually believed all that romantic bullshit? Jesus Christ, ISA. You're a catheterization lab nurse. I'm chief of cardiology married into one of Miami's most prominent families. What exactly did you think the endgame was here? That I'd give up everything for someone whose entire family survives on money I send them?" The cruelty was breathtaking in its clarity. 8 years of "I love you," and intimate confessions and Sebastian crying in her arms. All of it revealed as performance, lines delivered to maintain access to her body and her professional skills. She had been a convenience, a therapeutic tool, a paid-for body that he could use without consequence. Isadora felt something harden inside her chest, some final remnant of hope crystallizing into cold rage. "Then I want full repayment. Every dollar. $234,500. You have 30 days to pay it back or I'm reporting you to debt collections and immigration services." Sebastian laughed, actually laughed, the sound containing genuine amusement. "With what money? You send everything to the Philippines. You've got maybe $1,200 in savings. You're bluffing and we both know it." Isadora walked to her laptop and opened a folder labeled Evidence. The screen filled with organized files, audio recordings, video footage, financial documents, all meticulously cataloged and timestamped. Sebastian's face drained of color as she clicked through samples, his voice confessing to the 2013 medical error that killed Richard Morrison, his admission of falsifying surgical success rates and Medicare billing fraud, his description of destroying Diane Torres with obvious satisfaction, noting her suicide like it was a punchline to an amusing story. Video footage from Isadora's own apartment showing Sebastian doing lines of cocaine off her coffee table at 6:47 a.m. before heading to perform surgery. 12 separate instances with dates and times matching Palmetto Memorial's surgical schedules. Financial records documenting suspicious billing practices that Isadora had access to as a catheterization lab nurse who processed his procedure documentation. "Marry me," Isadora said quietly, her voice steady for the first time in the conversation. "Or I send everything to the state medical board, the DA, Margot's father, the Miami Herald, every hospital in Florida. Your career ends. Your reputation burns. You'll face criminal charges for Medicare fraud at minimum, possibly manslaughter for the Morrison death depending on statute of limitations. Choose right now." Sebastian's expression went blank, his mind clearly calculating options and finding none that didn't result in complete destruction. Then his face rearranged itself into something approximating contrition, the mask he wore when manipulation required softness rather than aggression. "You're right. I've been a coward. Give me 2 weeks to handle Margot properly, talk to divorce lawyers, figure out the logistics of separating our finances. We'll do this right. Promise. I love you, ISA. I always have, even when I've been too scared to act on it." He kissed her forehead with practiced tenderness. "Delete those files. Show me you trust me. This only works if we trust each other moving forward." Isadora didn't delete anything. She'd spent 8 years learning that Sebastian's promises were worth less than the breath required to speak them. But she wanted desperately to believe this time was different, that her ultimatum had finally forced him to choose her, that 8 years of devotion would be rewarded with the commitment she'd earned through sacrifice and suffering. She shouldn't have believed. She should have sent the files immediately and disappeared. Instead, she gave him 2 weeks that became her death sentence. The final weeks from February 14th through March 15th, 2024 consisted of Sebastian stalling with plausible excuses while secretly planning murder. Lawyers drawing up separation papers. Margot's father having health issues. Bad timing to announce divorce. Need to secure hospital privileges at other institutions first. Each excuse sounded reasonable enough to buy additional time. Meanwhile, Sebastian's search history told a different story. His personal laptop, later seized by investigators, showed Google searches that documented premeditation, MRI safety protocols, magnetic field strength, MRI accidents death rate statistics, MRI projectile injuries force calculation, MRI machine remote activation codes, MRI bore dimensions entrapment, hospital security camera blind spots Miami. He accessed Palmetto Memorial's MRI suite override codes on February 28, 2024, with IT logs showing he downloaded the technical manual to his personal device. He reviewed security camera coverage of the imaging wing, noting that cameras covered hallways and entrances but not the interior of MRI suites themselves. He studied Isadora's work schedule, learning that she typically stayed late on Mondays and Wednesdays for documentation, often walking through the imaging wing to coordinate patient transfers with radiology staff. Sebastian planned methodically, like he was planning surgery rather than murder. And on March 15, 2024, when Isadora sent her final ultimatum at 8:47 p.m., "You have until midnight tonight to give me definitive answer. Are we getting married? Or am I sending the evidence files? No more delays. Choose." Sebastian responded with the lie that would lure her to her death. "Yes, we're doing this. Meet me at hospital 10 p.m. I have documents, lawyer papers, resignation letter, job offers from other hospitals. Everything you wanted. I'm ready. I love you." Isadora believed him. She dressed carefully in black slacks and the white blouse Sebastian had once complimented. She drove to Palmetto Memorial Hospital, parked in the visitor lot, and badged into the building at 9:47 p.m., walking toward what she thought was finally her happy ending. Instead, she walked toward an MRI machine that Sebastian had prepared as a murder weapon, toward metal objects positioned to become projectiles, toward the bore of a machine where she would die screaming, while the man she'd loved for 8 years watched through the control room glass and felt nothing but relief that his problem was finally solved. Sebastian Vance left the charity gala at the Venetian Ballroom at 8:15 p.m., the security footage capturing him kissing Margot's cheek and explaining he had an emergency surgery consultation that couldn't wait. Margot didn't question the excuse because Sebastian's work frequently interrupted their social obligations, and she'd long ago stopped caring where he actually went as long as he maintained appearances when required. He drove his midnight blue Porsche 911 through Miami streets still humid from afternoon rain, arriving at Palmetto Memorial Hospital's parking garage at 8:32 p.m. according to the automated license plate reader that logged every vehicle entering the facility. He parked on the third level in a space far from the security cameras, entered through the physician's entrance using his badge, and took the service elevator to the second-floor imaging wing, where no cameras monitored the interior corridors due to budget cuts that had left surveillance gaps throughout the less trafficked areas of the hospital. At 8:41 p.m., Sebastian used his chief of cardiology override code to access MRI Suite 2C, a room that should have been locked and empty given that no scans were scheduled after 7 p.m. The suite contained a Siemens Magnetom 3 Tesla MRI machine weighing 60,000 pounds, with a magnetic field strength approximately 60,000 times that of Earth's natural magnetic field, powerful enough to pull metal objects across the room at deadly velocities if activated while ferromagnetic materials were present. The machine was powered down but maintained in ready state for emergency activation, and Sebastian had spent the previous 2 weeks studying the technical manual he'd downloaded, learning exactly how to operate the remote activation system through the hospital's administrative network. He pulled on latex gloves taken from a supply cart in the hallway and began staging the murder scene with methodical precision that demonstrated how thoroughly he'd planned this moment. The metal objects came from nearby storage areas and supply rooms where their absence wouldn't be noticed immediately. 3 pairs of surgical scissors from the sterile supply cabinet, each pair sharp enough to penetrate skin and muscle. For hemostats from the instrument cart outside operating room 3, their locking mechanisms ensuring they'd maintain rigid form during flight. A metal clipboard from the nurse's station, edges sharp enough to fracture bone. An E-cylinder oxygen tank weighing 10 pounds, small enough to accelerate rapidly but heavy enough to cause catastrophic impact trauma. And 4-pole from the recovery bay, its weighted base making it stable during normal use, but deadly when pulled at 40 miles per hour. A wheelchair from the equipment storage room 40 feet down the hallway, its 48-pound frame the largest projectile that might fit through the bore entrance. Sebastian positioned each item carefully around the opening of the MRI bore, calculating trajectories based on the machine's magnetic field gradient, ensuring that when activated the objects would be pulled inward with maximum force directly toward anyone trapped inside the cylindrical tunnel. At 9:02 p.m., Sebastian accessed the hospital's security system using Dr. Patricia Langford's administrator credentials. Langford had left her computer logged in 3 days earlier during lunch break, and Sebastian had used those unattended minutes to install keystroke logging software that captured her password for future use. He scheduled a maintenance malfunction for all cameras covering the second-floor imaging wing, timed to begin at 9:50 p.m. and conclude at 11:30 p.m., creating a surveillance blackout during the precise window when he planned to commit murder. The system would show the cameras going offline due to technical error, a plausible explanation given the aging infrastructure and documented history of intermittent failures. Sebastian then sent a text message from the burner phone he'd purchased with cash 2 weeks earlier. Running late. Meet me MRI suite instead of office. Level 2, suite 2C. More private. We can talk without interruption. Isadora Mercado badged into Palmetto Memorial Hospital at 9:47 p.m., security footage showing her walking through the main lobby with purposeful stride, carrying a leather bag containing her laptop with its encrypted evidence files. She wore black slacks and a white blouse, had applied makeup carefully, wanted to look composed and professional when Sebastian showed her the documents proving he was finally choosing her after 8 years of promises. She took the elevator to the second floor, walked down the corridor past the nurse's station where RN Cristina Vargas looked up from her charting and waved, later testifying that Isadora seemed nervous but determined, like someone approaching an important meeting that would change everything. At 9:47 p.m., Isadora's badge accessed MRI Suite 2C. The door opened. She stepped inside. The cameras monitoring the hallway went dark at 9:50 p.m., exactly as Sebastian had programmed. What happened in the next 18 minutes was reconstructed by investigators through physical evidence, forensic analysis, and the partial confession Sebastian would eventually provide during his psychological breakdown under interrogation. Isadora entered the suite and found Sebastian waiting inside, his expression unreadable in the dim lighting. "Close the door," he said, and she complied, still trusting despite 8 years of reasons not to. "Show me the papers," Isadora said, her voice containing hopeful anticipation. "The resignation letter, the divorce filings, the job offers. Show me we're really doing this." Sebastian's face transformed, the mask of warmth dissolving to reveal something cold and reptilian underneath. "There are no papers, ISA. There was never going to be papers. You blackmailed me. You threatened to destroy everything I've built over decades. Did you really think I'd just surrender?" Isadora's hand moved toward the door handle, understanding flooding through her with horrible clarity. "I have the evidence backed up to cloud servers you can't access. If anything happens to me, it sends automatically to—" Sebastian interrupted by grabbing her arm, his fingers digging into her flesh hard enough to leave bruises that forensic examiners would photograph during autopsy. "I don't believe you. You're too scared, too desperate, too dependent. You need me too much to ever really hurt me." Isadora fought then, her years of physical labor in hospital settings giving her strength that Sebastian hadn't anticipated. She clawed at his face, her fingernails leaving scratches that would later provide DNA evidence. She tried to knee him in the groin, but he twisted away, getting behind her, wrapping his arm around her neck in a chokehold that restricted blood flow to her brain without completely cutting off her airway. The bruising on her neck would later be documented as consistent with controlled strangulation, enough pressure to incapacitate but not enough to kill, the technique of someone who understood anatomy and wanted his victim conscious for what came next. Sebastian dragged Isadora's semi-conscious body toward the MRI bore, her legs scraping against the floor, her hands weakly trying to pry his arm from her throat. "You want to see inside a machine?" Sebastian's breathing was labored from exertion, his voice containing emotion that might have been rage or fear or sexual excitement, impossible to distinguish. "Let me show you what magnets do to people who don't know their place." He pushed her into the bore, the cylindrical tunnel measuring 23.6 inches in diameter and 6.9 feet in length, forcing her deep inside until her body was positioned approximately 4 feet from the opening. Isadora regained full consciousness then, trapped in the narrow space, her voice echoing off the curved walls as she screamed for help that wouldn't come in this isolated wing after hours. Sebastian walked to the control room separated from the MRI suite by a window of leaded glass, pulled out his phone, opened the hospital's administrative app that controlled imaging equipment, navigated to the MRI override controls, and hovered his finger over the button labeled Activate Scan Cycle. Isadora was screaming from inside the bore, her voice raw with terror. "Please, Sebastian, please. I'll delete everything. I'll disappear. I'll go back to Manila. Please don't do this." Sebastian looked through the glass at the woman who'd given him 8 years of devotion and had finally demanded something in return. "You should have known your place," he said to the empty control room, and pressed the button. The MRI machine activated with a low hum that built in intensity as the magnetic field ramped to full 3 Tesla strength in 18 seconds. The metal objects Sebastian had positioned around the bore entrance began to vibrate, then shift, then launch inward with the force of bullets fired from close range. The physics of MRI projectile effect are well documented in medical literature but rarely experienced with fatal results. Ferromagnetic objects accelerate at speeds exceeding 40 miles per hour in fractions of a second, the magnetic field gradient creating force that exceeds gravitational acceleration by orders of magnitude. The projectiles struck Isadora in sequence, each impact documented by the injury patterns forensic pathologists would later catalog. First came the surgical scissors at 2 seconds after activation, 3 pairs spinning through the air, 2 embedding in her torso and arms, 1 penetrating 3 inches into her right shoulder. Then the hemostats at 4 seconds for tools like metal daggers, 2 striking her left thigh and embedding to their full length, 1 in her abdomen, 1 hitting her face and breaking her nose while fracturing the orbital bone around her left eye. The metal clipboard at 7 seconds, spinning like a discus, its edge striking her skull above her left ear with enough force to create a depressed skull fracture and traumatic brain injury. The 4-pole at 9 seconds, its weighted base hitting her chest and fracturing 3 ribs with 1 puncturing her left lung. The oxygen tank at 11 seconds, 10 pounds of metal traveling at maximum velocity, striking her head directly and creating catastrophic skull fracture with massive intracranial hemorrhage that would prove immediately fatal. Finally, the wheelchair at 13 seconds, 48 pounds of metal and plastic crushing into the bore entrance, too large to fully enter but pinning Isadora's body inside and making escape impossible even if she'd survived the previous impacts. Isadora was conscious through the first 4 projectiles, her screaming cutting off abruptly when the oxygen tank struck her skull and ended brain function. Sebastian stood in the control room watching through the glass, his expression neutral, his heart rate elevated but steady at 98 beats per minute, according to the fitness tracker on his wrist that would later provide investigators with physiological data during the murder. He didn't vomit, didn't cry, didn't show any external sign of distress. He waited 15 minutes to ensure Isadora was dead before deactivating the machine at 10:23 p.m., the magnetic field dissipating slowly according to safety protocols. He didn't approach the body, understanding that residual magnetic forces could still be dangerous, and that he needed to leave no trace evidence connecting him to the scene. Sebastian exited MRI Suite 2C through the service door at 10:25 p.m., took the service stairs to the basement level, walked through the loading dock area where no cameras monitored after-hours activity, and reached his Porsche at 10:31 p.m. He drove home to Coral Gables, arriving at 10:38 p.m. to find Margot reading in their bedroom. "How was the consultation?" she asked without looking up from her book. "Routine. Patient stabilized," Sebastian replied, kissing her forehead with the same lips that had told Isadora he loved her hours earlier. He went to the primary suite bathroom and showered for 47 minutes, water temperature set to maximum heat, scrubbing every inch of skin. When he emerged, he gathered the clothes he'd worn and took them downstairs to the fireplace, burning them completely despite the absurdity of lighting a fire in August in Miami. Margot noticed but didn't comment. Long accustomed to her husband's eccentric behaviors, Sebastian took an Ambien from the bottle on his nightstand, lay down beside his wife, and eventually fell asleep at 1:30 a.m., while Isadora's body cooled in the MRI suite 12 miles away. Security guard Ramos Keene discovered the body at 11:45 p.m. during his standard rounds of the second floor. The door to MRI Suite 2C was unlocked, the machine was humming with active magnetic field, and when Keene looked inside he saw the wheelchair crushed against the bore entrance and blood spreading across the white floor in patterns that spoke of catastrophic trauma. He called 911 at 11:47 p.m., his voice shaking as he reported a woman trapped in an MRI machine with multiple apparent injuries, First responders arrived at 11:52 p.m. but couldn't approach the body while the magnetic field remained active, the metal on their uniforms and equipment pulling toward the machine with enough force to make movement dangerous. It took specialized MRI technicians 47 minutes to fully power down the system according to safety protocols. And when paramedics finally reached Isadora's body at 12:39 a.m., they pronounced her dead at the scene. Her injuries obviously incompatible with life. Lieutenant Maria Santos of Miami-Dade Police Homicide Division arrived at Palmetto Memorial Hospital at 1:47 a.m. on March 16, 2024, and knew within 15 minutes of examining the scene that she was investigating murder rather than accident. Santos was 41 years old with 16 years of homicide experience, had worked 89 murder cases with an 87% clearance rate, and possessed the particular cynicism that came from seeing what humans did to each other when they thought they could get away with it. The official theory being floated by hospital administration was tragic workplace accident. Isadora Mercado had entered an active MRI suite carrying metal objects, unaware of the danger, resulting in her death through protocol violation and operator error. But Santos saw immediate inconsistencies that contradicted accidental death. Isadora was an 8-year veteran of cardiac catheterization with advanced training and annual MRI safety certification, exactly the kind of medical professional who would never make such a fundamental error. The badge access logs showed Isadora entering the suite at 9:47 p.m., but MRI machines didn't activate themselves. Someone with override codes had powered up the system remotely. Security cameras covering the imaging wing had experienced convenient malfunction from 9:50 p.m. to 11:30 p.m., precisely during the window when murder occurred. Most damning, the metal objects that killed Isadora weren't items she would have carried. Surgical scissors, hemostats, oxygen tanks, wheelchairs weren't equipment that catheterization lab nurses transported through hospitals, and their positioning around the bore entrance before activation suggested deliberate staging rather than accidental presence. Santos' team conducted interviews with night shift staff, building a timeline of Isadora's final hours. Cristina Vargas, the RN working the second-floor nurses' station, testified that she'd seen Isadora walking toward the imaging wing at approximately 9:45 p.m., that Isadora had seemed nervous but determined, that she'd been carrying only her personal bag and hadn't had any metal objects visible. The bag was found in the corner of MRI Suite 2C, away from the magnetic field's influence, containing Isadora's laptop, phone, wallet, keys, and a pen. The laptop was password protected, but Santos obtained a warrant and had the IT forensics team crack the encryption, revealing the folder labeled Evidence Under Backup that contained 8 years of documentation cataloging Sebastian Vance's crimes. The audio recordings played in the Homicide Division's conference room were devastating. Sebastian's voice confessing to the 2013 medical error at Bayside Regional Hospital that killed Richard Morrison, describing how he'd falsified the chart to cover his mistake. Sebastian explaining his systematic destruction of Diane Torres, the pharmaceutical representative he'd gotten fired and blacklisted, mentioning her eventual suicide with obvious satisfaction. Sebastian discussing cocaine use before surgeries, 12 documented instances with dates and times matching Palmetto Memorial's surgical schedules. The video files showed Sebastian in Isadora's apartment doing lines of cocaine off her coffee table at 6:47 a.m. before heading to perform complex cardiac procedures. The financial documents revealed suspicious billing practices, upcoding procedures to generate higher Medicare reimbursements, charging for services never rendered. Most significant was the text message thread recovered from Isadora's phone, showing the escalating ultimatum she'd given Sebastian and his false promise to meet her at the hospital with divorce papers and job offers from other institutions. The final message was time-stamped March 15, 2024 at 10:02 p.m., sent from a number not stored in Isadora's contacts. "I'm here. Suite 2C. Come now." Investigators traced the number to a burner phone purchased with cash at an electronics store in South Miami on March 1, 2024. Security footage from the store showed a man matching Sebastian's build and height making the purchase while carefully keeping his face turned away from cameras. Sebastian was brought in for questioning on March 19, 2024, accompanied by his attorney Robert Castellano, a high-profile defense lawyer charging $850 per hour who specialized in representing wealthy professionals accused of crimes. Sebastian's initial statement was rehearsed and confident. He'd been home with Margot the entire evening of March 15th, had left the charity gala at 8:15 p.m. and driven directly to their Coral Gables estate, had never gone to Palmetto Memorial Hospital. His badge must have been stolen or cloned, a common security problem at the hospital. His relationship with Isadora had been brief and professional, a minor indiscretion years ago that had ended amicably. He had no motive to harm her and no knowledge of any evidence files she might have compiled. But Sebastian made critical errors during the interrogation that revealed consciousness of guilt. When Santos asked about his relationship with Isadora, Sebastian described it as brief, maybe 6 months, 8 years ago, then immediately corrected himself to say he meant discreet rather than brief, revealing he knew the affair had lasted much longer than he was claiming. When Santos mentioned evidence files on Isadora's laptop, Sebastian said, "I don't know what's on them," before investigators had revealed the contents, demonstrating guilty knowledge he shouldn't have possessed. The physical evidence systematically destroyed Sebastian's alibi. Margot, interviewed separately, testified that Sebastian had arrived home around 10:40 p.m., much later than he claimed, that he'd gone straight to the shower and remained there for nearly an hour, and that he'd burned clothing in their fireplace despite it being August in Miami with temperatures in the 80s. Cell phone tower data obtained through warrant showed Sebastian's phone pinging towers adjacent to Palmetto Memorial Hospital parking garage at 8:32 p.m., near the hospital's north wing where the MRI suite was located at 9:15 p.m., then moving toward Coral Gables at 10:28 p.m. The timeline matched Margot's testimony and contradicted Sebastian's claim of going straight home from the gala. Sebastian's personal laptop, seized through search warrant, revealed Google search history that documented premeditation. Searches for MRI magnetic field projectile injuries on March 1st, MRI safety protocols on March 3rd, MRI machine remote activation override codes on March 8th, and MRI accidents deaths United States on March 12th. Hospital IT logs showed Sebastian had accessed the MRI system technical manual and override codes on February 28, 2024, downloading the files to his personal device. Security system logs revealed that Dr. Patricia Langford's administrator credentials had been used to schedule the camera malfunction on March 15, and forensic analysis of her computer showed keystroke logging software installed on March 12 during a period when Sebastian had been observed using her workstation while she was at lunch. The psychological break came during Sebastian's 4th interrogation session on March 22, 2024, after 72 hours of isolation and mounting evidence that his carefully constructed alibi was collapsing. Castellano had stepped out for a bathroom break, leaving Sebastian alone with Santos and her partner Detective Raymond Torres. Santos leaned across the table, her voice carrying exhaustion and disgust in equal measure. "We know you killed her, Sebastian. We have your phone records placing you at the hospital. We have your computer searches showing you researched MRI deaths. We have your badge accessing the override codes. We have 8 years of evidence showing you trapped her financially and destroyed anyone who got close to her. You're going down for this. The only question is degree. First-degree premeditated murder or second-degree heat of passion. Help us understand what happened. Make it second-degree. Tell us your side." Sebastian's facade shattered. He didn't confess directly, but his rant revealed everything. "She owned me. 8 years of listening to her crying about her pathetic family, throwing money at problems that weren't my responsibility, pretending to care about her immigrant sob stories. I elevated her from poverty. Without me, she'd be in some Manila slum married to a fisherman. And she had the audacity to blackmail me? To demand I throw away my career, my marriage, my entire life because she spread her legs and thought that made her my equal? I loved her, or convinced myself I did. But love doesn't give you the right to destroy someone. She was going to ruin everything, take everything I'd built, everything my father died before achieving. You ask if I killed her? I protected myself. That's all anyone does, protect themselves from people trying to destroy them." Castellano returned and immediately terminated the interview, but the statement had been recorded. The jury would eventually hear those words and understand exactly who Sebastian Vance was beneath the veneer of professional success and surgical brilliance. The trial began in September 2024, 7 months after Isadora's death. State Attorney Jennifer Morrison, 47, prosecuted with methodical precision, constructing a narrative of predatory grooming, financial exploitation, systematic isolation, and ultimately murder when the victim finally demanded freedom. The evidence presented over 6 weeks included all 47 audio recordings of Sebastian's confessions played in their entirety, the jury listening to his voice describing crimes with casual indifference to the harm he'd caused. Videos of cocaine use before surgeries shocked the courtroom and ended any remaining sympathy for the defendant. Financial records showed $234,500 in loans that created dependency impossible to escape. Phone records and cell tower data placed Sebastian at the murder scene during the precise window when Isadora died. Computer forensics proved he'd researched MRI deaths and accessed override codes weeks before the murder. The most devastating testimony came from Isadora's mother, Elena Mercado, appearing via video conference from Cebu City. Elena was 63 years old, breast cancer survivor, speaking through tears and a translator. "My daughter sent money every month for 8 years. She told us about wonderful doctor who would marry her someday. 3 days before her death, she called me and said, 'Mama, I think my dreams are finally coming true.' Then police called to say she was dead. She sacrificed her own dream of becoming a doctor to save our family. That man used her and threw her away like garbage." Robert Castellano's defense strategy argued circumstantial evidence and alternative theories, that Isadora was mentally unstable as evidenced by prescriptions for anxiety medication, that she might have committed suicide to frame Sebastian, that her death could have been accidental during a dissociative episode. But cross-examination destroyed these claims when Morrison asked how suicide or accident explained defensive wounds, bruising consistent with strangulation, Sebastian's computer searches, and his presence at the hospital during the murder window. The jury deliberated 14 hours before reaching a compromise verdict: second-degree murder. They believed Sebastian had killed Isadora but couldn't prove beyond reasonable doubt that he'd planned the murder weeks in advance rather than making an impulsive decision when confronted with blackmail. The judge sentenced him to 25 years to life on November 18, 2024. The aftermath was swift and comprehensive. Sebastian's medical license was permanently revoked. Margot divorced him within 48 hours, keeping all marital assets under their prenuptial agreement. The Mercado family filed wrongful death civil suit seeking $50 million in damages. Sebastian was transferred to Everglades Correctional Institute in protective custody, too high profile for general population. Investigators discovered Sebastian's pattern of predatory behavior. Diane Torres confirmed as suicide victim after Sebastian destroyed her career. Dr. Priya Sharma, whose medical career ended after Sebastian used intimate photos to coerce her. Surgical resident Melissa Keene, who withdrew harassment complaints after Sebastian showed her secret recordings. Sebastian Vance was revealed as serial predator who'd been operating for over a decade, using institutional power to trap and destroy vulnerable women. Palmetto Memorial Hospital settled the civil lawsuit for $12 million rather than face trial, exposing their institutional failure to protect employees. The Filipino community in Miami created Isadora Mercado Justice Garden at St. Catherine's Catholic Church, where annual vigils honor her memory. Sebastian sits in prison writing appeals that are systematically denied, seeing Isadora's face every night in his cell. The bright-eyed 31-year-old who walked into his catheterization lab believing America held opportunity rather than exploitation. Elena Mercado tends a garden of white orchids in Cebu, Isadora's favorite flower, talking to them like her daughter can hear. Maybe she can. Maybe that's the only mercy left in this story of power, predation, and a woman who demanded dignity and received death instead.